The kid behind the counter picked the blacksmith hammer up by the head, bounced the handle against the glass twice, like he was testing a drumstick, and set it back down. Yeah, old hammer. Heavy. We don't really take tools unless they're power tools. I can do $20. Nathaniel Gaines stood on the other side of the counter, 79 years old. The brown leather work gloves his late wife, Dorothy, had bought him at the Tractor Supply in 2014, folded in his back pocket the way he always carried them, the dark iron blacksmith hammer sitting on the glass between them, and watched a 25-year-old in a State Line pawn polo look at the thing that had been on the mantel in his family's house since 1866 and see $20 worth of rusty iron. That was my family's, Nathaniel said, quiet. The kid, Beckham, by the crooked name tag, shrugged and pushed the hammer an inch across the glass with the back of his knuckles. Sure, 20. Final. Here's what that kid in the pawn shop didn't know. Here's what nobody in that shop knew. The hand-forged cross-peen blacksmith hammer Nathaniel Gaines had just set down on that counter was worth $156,000. It was an 1843 Tredegar Ironworks production hammer, forged at the most important industrial ironworks in the antebellum American South. The stamp on the hammerhead, half obscured under 181 years of forge scale and rust, read Tredegar, Richmond, 1843. But the value wasn't in the maker. The value was in who had swung it. Carved into the base of the hickory handle, in letters so small they looked like grain cracks unless you knew what you were looking at, were the initials S.G., 1843, Solomon Gaines, Nathaniel's great-great-great-grandfather, an enslaved ironworker at the Tredegar Ironworks from 1838 to 1865. One of the most highly skilled forge hands at the most important foundry in the Confederacy. Solomon had made cannon barrels, he had made railroad wheels, he had made the anchor chain for the CSS Virginia. And on the day the Union Army entered Richmond in April 1865, Solomon Gaines had walked out of the Tredegar Works with one object, his hammer. He had carried it 11 miles south on foot to a plot of land a Freedmen's Bureau agent would help him file on 6 months later, and he had opened his own forge. The hammer had never left the family. The American Civil War Museum in Richmond had been searching for documented Tredegar enslaved worker tools, tools that could be attributed to a named enslaved craftsman with verifiable production records, for over 40 years. The Tredegar's own enslaved worker ledger, held at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, listed Solomon Gaines by name. His production output was recorded in quarterly tonnage. His skill grade was listed as first class, but no physical tool had ever been matched to a named enslaved Tredegar worker. Until now. This is the story of how Nathaniel Gaines walked into State Line Pawn on a Monday morning in November with $1,200 of trouble in his head and walked out with a piece of his great-great-great-grandfather's hands and a piece of the most painful and complicated chapter of American industrial history that his family had been keeping on the mantle for 159 years. Before I tell you what happened when the expert walked through that door, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let me tell you about Nathaniel. Nathaniel Solomon Gaines was born in 1945 in Roanoke, Virginia. His family had been in the Roanoke Valley since 1872, when Solomon Gaines's grandson, Nathaniel's great-grandfather, had walked the 60 miles from his grandfather's forge in Chesterfield County to Roanoke to work on the Norfolk and Western Railway as a section hand. The Gaines family had worked the railroad, worked the steel mills, worked the foundries. Nathaniel's father, Raymond, had spent 34 years as a welder at the Norfolk and Western shops in Roanoke. Nathaniel himself had spent 39 years at the same shops, first as a helper, then as a boilermaker, then as a foreman, until the shops closed in 2005 and Nathaniel took early retirement at 60. Married Dorothy Calloway in 1968. 2 daughters, Lorraine, now 54 and living in Richmond, and Ruth, 51, in Charlotte. Dorothy had died in 2023 of kidney failure. Slow, 2 years of dialysis, 3 months of hospice at home, gone on a Thursday in October. The furnace was the problem. The oil furnace in the basement of the small brick row house on 10th Street had failed in late October. Heat exchanger cracked, same as what happened to furnaces that were 40 years old and had been running on the cheapest fuel oil Nathaniel could find for the last decade. The heating contractor had quoted $1,200 for a replacement unit installed. Without it, Nathaniel was running 2 space heaters and wearing his coat inside. His railroad pension was $1,890 a month. Social Security added $2,040. After property taxes, insurance, the electric, Dorothy's remaining medical debt at $175 a month, his blood pressure medications and groceries, he had about $100 of slack in a good month. He did not have $1,200. He could have called Lorraine in Richmond or Ruth in Charlotte. Lorraine worked in hospital administration and was still paying her own student loans at 54. Ruth was a teacher's aide raising 3 grandchildren after her daughter's second husband walked out. Nathaniel had not asked either of his daughters for $1 in 20 years. He was not going to start over a furnace. For 9 days, he wore his coat inside and slept under 3 blankets and ate his meals standing over the space heater in the kitchen. On the 10th morning, Monday, he went to the living room mantel. The hammer had been on the mantel for as long as Nathaniel had been alive. It had been on the mantel before Nathaniel was born. It had been on every mantel the Gaines family had ever had in Roanoke. The rooming house on Henry Street in 1872, the shotgun house on Gilmer Avenue in 1903, the brick row house on 10th Street his father had bought in 1947. Raymond Gaines had told his son the story of the hammer exactly once, on the back stoop of the 10th Street house in 1963, the summer Nathaniel turned 18. "That hammer was your great-great-great-granddaddy Solomon's," Raymond had said. "He was a slave at the Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond. He was a forge hand, the best one they had, and they had 200. He made cannon barrels for the Confederacy because they made him." The day the Union walked into Richmond, he picked up his hammer and he walked out. Nobody stopped him. He walked 11 miles south, and he started his own forge, and he never looked back. That hammer is the only thing he took. It's the only thing that was his. Raymond had paused. He had looked at his son. "You don't sell it, Nathaniel. You don't give it away. You don't lend it. It stays on the mantel. When I'm gone, you keep it there. That hammer is who we are. It's where we come from. It's a hard place to come from, son. But that hammer says we came from it with our skill and our name and nothing else. And that was enough." Nathaniel had nodded. He had been 18. He had not understood all of it then. He understood it now. He stood in the living room at 6 in the morning with the hammer in his hands and Dorothy's hospice blanket still folded on the couch and the space heater glowing orange in the kitchen doorway, and he did something he'd sworn he would never do. He put the hammer in a canvas grocery bag and drove to town. The 2001 Ford Crown Victoria, a former Roanoke City police cruiser Nathaniel had bought at auction in 2008 for $1,100, started on the second try. He drove the 2 miles to State Line Pawn on Williamson Road and parked at 9:08 on a cold gray November morning. He sat in the car with the canvas bag on the passenger seat. He put his hand on the bag. He felt the weight of the hammer through the canvas. 4.5 pounds of hand-forged iron, Solomon's weight, Solomon's balance, Solomon's work. He had made promises in his life. He had kept them. He had promised Dorothy at Mount Moriah Baptist in 1968, and he had kept that promise for 55 years. He had promised his father on the back stoop in 1963, "You don't sell it." And he had kept that promise for 61 years. He took the bag in both hands and went inside. The bell over the door jangled. Beckham was behind the counter on a laptop and looked up after about 6 seconds. "Help you? I've got a blacksmith hammer. My family's. Old, from before the Civil War." "Let's see it." Nathaniel took the hammer out of the canvas bag and set it on the glass. The hammer was about 14 inches long, a dark iron cross-peen head 4.5 pounds, mounted on a hickory handle that had been replaced once, maybe in the 1880s, and not since. The head was forge-blackened with a century and a half of scale, the striking face worn slightly convex from tens of thousands of blows, the cross-peen end mushroom diffraction from years of drawing steel. The stamp on one side of the head, the maker's mark, was half buried under rust and forge scale. The initials on the base of the handle were invisible unless you knew to look. Beckham picked the hammer up by the head. He bounced the handle against the glass counter twice. He turned the head over. He squinted. Yeah, old hammer. Real old. Heavy. We get tools. Mostly people bring in Snap-on, DeWalt, stuff I can actually sell. Hand-forged blacksmith hammers are like $100 new at a Farrier Supply. This one's rusty. $20. It's from 1843. It was forged at the Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond. My great-great-great-grandfather. Sure, Pops. Beckham set the hammer down on the glass. Hard. The iron head struck the glass with a sharp crack that made Nathaniel's stomach drop, and a small chip appeared in the glass countertop, a white star mark the size of a dime. Beckham glanced at the chip. Didn't apologize. 20. Or take it home. I'm not begging. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. He put both hands flat on the counter. He thought about the furnace. He thought about Dorothy under the hospice blanket. He thought about his father on the back stoop. That hammer is who we are. He did not pick up the hammer. He did not say yes. He did not say no. He stood there with both hands flat on the glass and his mouth closed tight, because the only other thing he could do was cry in front of a 25-year-old, and Nathaniel Gaines had not cried in front of another human being since Dorothy's funeral 13 months ago. The bell over the door jangled again. A man came in, mid-60s, black, medium height, solid build, with a close-cropped salt and pepper beard and a shaved head that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. He wore a charcoal wool overcoat over a white shirt and dark tie, charcoal trousers, polished black brogues, and round gold-rimmed glasses. He carried a small black leather attaché case in his right hand and a rolled-up copy of the Journal of the American Iron and Steel History Society in his left. He came 2 steps inside the door, glanced at the counter, and stopped. He looked at the hammer. For a long time, he did not move. His eyes moved from the hammer head to the handle to the stamp on the side of the head, the stamp that was half buried under forge scale, and then back to the head. He tilted his head 1 degree to the right, his lips pressed together. "Excuse me," he said. His voice was deep and careful, with the cadence of a man who lectured for a living. "Sir, is that a forge hammer?" Beckham looked up. "Old guy's selling, $20. The man did not look at Beckham. He looked at Nathaniel. "Sir, my name is Dr. Marcus Hollins. I am the Director of Industrial History at the American Civil War Museum in Richmond and a research fellow at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. I am in Roanoke this week, giving a lecture series at Virginia Tech on antebellum Southern ironwork. I came in here because I am always looking for early American tools. Would you permit me to examine that hammer?" Nathaniel found his voice. "You're asking me?" "It's yours, isn't it?" "Yes, sir." "Then yes, sir. I am asking you. And I would ask you, please, not to let anyone strike the head against anything hard again. That stamp on the side is a maker's mark, sir. If that mark is what I think it might be, this hammer should not be hitting glass counters." Beckham took a half step back from the counter and put his hands in his pockets. Dr. Hollins set his attaché on the counter and opened it. He drew out a pair of folded white cotton archival gloves, a 10x jeweler's loop, 2 LED flashlights, a small stiff bristle brass brush in a leather sleeve, a soft sable brush, a bottle of conservation-grade rust stabilizer he did not open, and a leather-bound field notebook. He pulled the gloves on finger by finger. "May I lift it, sir?" Nathaniel nodded. Dr. Hollins picked the hammer up with both gloved hands, one under the head, one under the handle, and laid it on a soft black cloth he spread on the counter. He held the brass brush over the maker's stamp on the side of the head. He looked at Nathaniel. May I clean this stamp? Very gently. I'll use the brass brush. It will not damage the iron, only remove the loose scale over the lettering. Yes, sir. Dr. Hollins brushed the stamp with 3 slow strokes. 4. 5. The loose forged scale fell away in dark flakes. He switched to the sable brush and swept the flakes off the iron. He clicked on the LED flashlight and held it at a grazing angle across the stamp. He brought the loop to his eye. He went still. He set the loop down. He picked it back up. He looked again. He set it down again. "Oh," he said, very quietly. He turned the hammer over. He examined the other side of the head. He examined the eye where the handle passed through. He tilted the hammer and looked at the base of the hickory handle where it flared out beneath the head. He shone the flashlight at a grazing angle across the wood grain. He went still a second time. "Mr. Gaines. Nathaniel Gaines. Mr. Gaines." Dr. Hollins set the hammer down on the black cloth with a deliberateness that Nathaniel recognized as the deliberateness of a man choosing his next words very carefully. The stamp on the head of this hammer reads, in hand-punched iron letters, period correct for the 1840s, Tredegar, Richmond, 1843. Nathaniel nodded slowly. "And the base of the hickory handle, Mr. Gaines, has 2 letters carved into it, very small, easy to mistake for grain cracks. The letters are SG. Beside the letters is the number 1843. Nathaniel's knees went soft. He reached for the stool. "Mr. Gaines, the Tredegar Iron Works was the largest ironworks in the American South from approximately 1838 to 1865. It produced cannon, railroad iron, ship armor, anchor chain, locomotive wheels, and virtually every major category of iron product the Confederacy required during the Civil War. It employed over 1,000 workers at its peak. Roughly half of those workers were enslaved black men, men who were hired out by their owners to the foundry or who were owned directly by the foundry's proprietor, Joseph Reed Anderson." He paused. The Tredegar's enslaved worker ledger, held at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, records the names, skill grades, and quarterly tonnage outputs of every enslaved worker at the foundry from 1838 to 1865. I have spent 22 years reading that ledger. On page 47, entry dated March 1838, there's a name, Solomon, property of J.R. Anderson, forge hand, first class. First class was the highest skill grade. It meant Solomon could forge any product in the Tredegar catalog without supervision. His quarterly tonnage outputs, Mr. Gaines, were consistently the highest or second highest of any forge hand at the works, enslaved or free, for 27 consecutive years. The fluorescent tube over the door flickered. The Tredegar ledger records that Solomon's surname, which enslaved people, were not formally given but which many used among themselves and which the ledger occasionally noted in parentheses, was Gaines. Nathaniel was sitting on the stool with both hands on the counter. He had not spoken. "Mr. Gaines, on April 3rd, 1865, the day Union forces entered Richmond, the Tredegar workers, both enslaved and free, walked out of the foundry. Many of the enslaved workers took tools with them. Almost none of those tools have ever been identified. The American Civil War Museum has been searching for documented Tredegar enslaved worker tools, tools that can be matched to a named enslaved craftsman in the production ledger, for over 40 years. We have found none." He looked at the hammer on the black cloth. "This is the first." Nobody in the shop spoke. Beckham had not moved. "Mr. Gaines, at professional appraisal, with documentation from the Tredegar enslaved worker ledger, the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, and independent metallurgical dating, this hammer, as the only known surviving tool attributable to a named first-class enslaved forge hand at the Tredegar Iron Works, would be valued for institutional acquisition between $120,000 and $200,000, conservative estimate $156,000. Beckham cleared his throat. It took him 2 tries. I was going to say 30. I meant 30. Nathaniel didn't look at him. He was looking at the hammer on the black cloth and thinking about Solomon. He was thinking about a man he had never met, a man born into slavery, a man who had been owned, a man whose body and labor and skill had been the property of another man. Swinging this hammer 60,000 times a year for 27 years, making cannon barrels and railroad wheels and anchor chain for a nation that held him in bondage, and on the morning that nation fell, picking up his hammer and walking out, not running, walking, 11 miles south, on foot, with a hammer. That hammer is who we are, his father had said. It's where we come from. It's a hard place to come from, son, but that hammer says we came from it with our skill and our name and nothing else, and that was enough. Dr. Hollins handed Nathaniel his card. Mr. Gaines, take your time, talk to your daughters, but please, sir, do not leave this hammer in this shop. Nathaniel took the card. He took the hammer from Dr. Hollins's gloved hands with both of his own. He put it back in the canvas grocery bag. He stood up from the stool. He nodded once at Dr. Hollins. He walked out past Beckham without a word. In the parking lot, sitting in the Crown Victoria with the engine running and the heat taking its time, Nathaniel Gaines held the canvas bag on his lap and cried for the first time since Dorothy's funeral. He called Lorraine that night in Richmond. He called Ruth in Charlotte. The three of them met the following Saturday at the kitchen table on 10th Street, the same table Raymond had eaten breakfast at for 41 years, the same table Dorothy had died 6 feet from. And Nathaniel told them the story. Lorraine, who worked in hospital administration 3 miles from the Tredegar site and had driven past it every day for 26 years without knowing her family's name was in the ledger, sat with both hands over her mouth and did not speak for a long time. Ruth cried. Nathaniel made coffee. They called Dr. Hollins at 9 the following Monday. The American Civil War Museum sent a team of conservators and a metallurgist to Roanoke in December. The hammer was carefully cleaned under archival conditions at the Roanoke Historical Society. The maker's stamp was fully revealed. Tredegar, Richmond, 1843. The SG initials on the handle base were photographed and matched against the Tredegar ledger entry. The iron was metallurgically dated, consistent with Virginia bog iron smelted at Tredegar in the early 1840s. The hickory handle, carbon dated, was consistent with a replacement in the 1880s, likely done by Solomon himself at his own forge in Chesterfield County. The museum acquired the hammer for permanent display through a 99-year family loan. The museum paid the Gaines family $148,000. The display in the museum's Tredegar Gallery, on the grounds of the Tredegar Ironworks itself, on the bank of the James River in Richmond, was dedicated in February on the weekend nearest to the anniversary of the fall of Richmond. The hammer was mounted on a custom iron stand, forged by a present-day Black Richmond blacksmith named Calvin Booth as a donation to the exhibit. The placard read, Cross Peen, Blacksmith Hammer, Tredegar Ironworks, Richmond, Virginia, 1843. Forged and used by Solomon Gaines, circa 1815 to 1891, an enslaved ironworker at the Tredegar Works from 1838 to 1865. Solomon was rated first class, the highest skill grade, and recorded the highest quarterly tonnage output of any forge hand at the works for 27 consecutive years. On April 3, 1865, the day Union forces entered Richmond, Solomon walked out of the foundry carrying this hammer. He subsequently homesteaded land in Chesterfield County and operated his own forge until his death in 1891. The hammer remained in the Gaines family for 159 years, on loan from the family of Nathaniel S. Gaines, Roanoke, Virginia. Lorraine drove her father to Richmond for the dedication. They stood on the Tredegar grounds, the same ground Solomon had walked on every day for 27 years, and looked at the James River and the ruined stone foundations of the foundry buildings and the new museum built among them. Nathaniel wore the dark suit he'd worn to Dorothy's funeral. He stood in front of the case for a long time without speaking. Then he said, quiet enough that only Lorraine heard him, "You did enough, Granddaddy. You did more than enough." The museum's director had asked Nathaniel if he wanted to say anything at the ceremony. Nathaniel had said no. Then, as the director was about to move on, Nathaniel had changed his mind. He stood at the lectern and looked out at a room of 200 people and said, "My daddy told me that Hammer was who we are. He said, it says we came from a hard place with our skill and our name and nothing else, and that was enough. I've been thinking about that for 61 years. I think what my daddy meant is that Solomon didn't take the cannon. He didn't take the railroad wheel. He didn't take anything that belonged to the men who owned him. He took the one thing that was his, the tool in his hand. That's what a free man takes, the thing he made with." He sat down. The room stood. He paid for the furnace. He paid the property taxes 3 years forward. He paid off the last of Dorothy's medical debt and drove to the hospital billing office and thanked the woman at the desk. He sent Lorraine $20,000 and Ruth $20,000 and told both of them not to argue. He set up trust accounts for his 5 grandchildren. He had the front steps of the 10th Street house repaired. They had been crumbling since 2019. He bought Dorothy a new headstone with her full name and a line beneath that read, "Wife, Mother." She kept the light on. The Roanoke Times ran the story on a Sunday. The Richmond Times-Dispatch ran it the day after the dedication. The Washington Post ran a long feature. The New York Times ran an editorial. Smithsonian Magazine ran a cover story in April. A letter came to Nathaniel's post office box in March. It was from a woman named Teresa Gaines Walker, 67 years old, in Petersburg, Virginia. She had done 20 years of genealogical research on the Gaines family of Chesterfield County. She had a daguerreotype, taken in 1889 at a photographer's studio in Richmond, of an elderly black man in a dark wool suit sitting in a wooden chair with his hands folded in his lap. The man's hands were enormous. The fingers were scarred. The photographer had written on the back of the image, in pencil, in the custom of the era, "Solomon Gaines, blacksmith, Chesterfield County, Virginia, aged approximately 74 years. It was the only known photograph of Solomon Gaines. His hands were the first thing you saw. Nathaniel had the photograph framed. It hangs above the mantel on 10th Street, in the spot where the Hammer used to be. And the next Wednesday morning, back home in Roanoke, Nathaniel sat down at his usual booth at the Waffle House on Williamson Road with his 2 oldest friends, Chester Morris and Leon Bibb, the way he had every Wednesday for 21 years. Chester looked at him over the rim of his coffee mug. "Heard you made the Times, Nathaniel." "Heard that." "Tredegar, huh?" "Tredegar." Leon shook his head. $20. $20, Nathaniel agreed. The 3 of them laughed. The quiet, chest-deep laugh of old men who have lived long enough to know that the world rarely sees what matters, and that sometimes, if you wait long enough, it finally does. A kid in a pawn shop looked at that hammer and said $20. He didn't know. They never do. If stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel because some things have hidden worth.